Well, that's right. The leaders of this team say what they've found is very exciting and very convincing.
They arrived to build a new world and vanished without a trace. In 1587, 115 English settlers disappeared from Roanoke Island.
About 115 men, women, and children, along with John White, the governor, arrived off the coast of North Carolina,
leaving behind only one word: Croatoan.
And the letter C-R-O carved into a tree.
No bodies, no graves, just questions.
They're gone, the entire colony.
For centuries, it remained America's oldest mystery.
It is one of America's oldest unsolved mysteries, and it happened in our own backyard.
But in 2025, scientists uncovered groundbreaking evidence that flips the story on its head. Join us as we uncover the truth behind the lost colony.
What really happened to the lost colony of Roanoke?
The Dream of Rowanoke. Long before the word mystery was ever attached to Roanoke, it began with a dream, one that would later unravel into America's oldest unsolved disappearance. In the summer of 1587, 3 English ships braved the dangerous waters of the Atlantic and anchored near Roanoke Island, a stretch of land off the coast of what is now North Carolina. On board were 115 settlers, men, women, and children, who carried more than supplies. They carried the hope of building England's first lasting colony in the New World. This group was led by John White, an artist, and the colony's appointed governor.
John White accidentally spills a blob of paint, makes an error, and it's just covered up with a piece of parchment. Maybe it's something more. There's only one way to find out.
He brought not just leadership, but also first-hand knowledge of the region from an earlier voyage. These settlers came from different walks of life: farmers ready to tame unfamiliar soil, carpenters and craftsmen skilled in building tools and homes, and mothers determined to raise families in a place far from all they knew. Their arrival marked a new chapter in England's push for expansion. Unlike the 2 earlier attempts that ended in failure due to violence and starvation, this group came prepared. They brought seeds for planting, livestock for food, and blueprints for a colony that could survive on its own. Soon after landing, they built a wooden fort surrounded by a wall of sharpened logs, designed to protect them from the weather and any possible conflict. The land they chose offered rich fishing waters and forests filled with game, but it also came with serious challenges. Winters could be bitter, droughts could ruin crops, and forming peaceful relations with native tribes like the Secatan and Croatoan would prove difficult. While some of these tribes welcomed the settlers with caution, others remembered past wrongs and were slow to trust. Still, the settlers worked with purpose. They planted what they could, fixed their fishing nets, and began trading with nearby villages. Beads, metal tools, and cloth were exchanged for corn, fish, and advice on surviving in the wild. Then, in August, a historic moment added deeper meaning to their mission. Virginia Dare, John White's granddaughter, was born, the first English child born on American soil.
Eleanor Dare gives birth to her daughter, Virginia, the first English child born in North America.
Her birth was more than a family milestone. It was a symbol of hope. The settlers believed that if a child could be born here, a new society could grow here too. But behind their progress, worry began to grow. Supplies ran low faster than expected, and they had no clear way to contact England for help. The ocean that had brought them to Roanoke now cut them off. Their dream was alive, but fragile. What lay ahead would test their strength and shape a mystery that the world would puzzle over for centuries to come. John White's departure. If there was a moment that turned the Roanoke colony from hopeful settlement to legendary mystery, it was when John White stepped onto that ship. His departure, meant to be brief, would trigger a chain of events that left historians baffled for over 400 years. In 1587, White sailed back to England to gather badly needed supplies, unaware that this trip would seal the colony's fate. By late summer, Roanoke's situation had become desperate. The settlers were running low on food, tools, and other critical resources. Crops had yet to yield, and relationships with nearby native tribes were fragile. As governor, White knew he had little choice. Though it broke him to leave behind his daughter Eleanor, her newborn Virginia Dare, and more than 100 other settlers, he promised to return swiftly. Before departing, he gave one final instruction. If the colony had to move, they should carve their new location into a tree or fence post. If they were in danger, they should include a cross. White's plan to return within months fell apart almost immediately. Back in England, he found a country bracing for war. The looming threat of the Spanish Armada had forced Queen Elizabeth I to commandeer all seaworthy vessels for defense.
But the problem with this is there is a stay of all shipping commanded by Queen Elizabeth I because the Spanish Armada are making the most untimely arrival.
Merchant ships were grounded. Explorers were sidelined. White pleaded for passage, but was turned away repeatedly. What was meant to be a short supply mission turned into a 3-year nightmare. White's letters from this period reflect deep regret. Powerless and stranded in London, he could only imagine what had become of his family and the others. Hunger, disease, or violence could have taken hold. Were they still alive? Had they relocated? The thought of returning too late haunted him. Finally, in 1590, White secured passage and sailed back to Roanoke. But what he found wasn't a colony. It was a ghost town. The houses were dismantled. The fort was abandoned. There were no signs of struggle, no bodies, and no graves.
There's no evidence that there was any kind of battle. There's no evidence of bones or bodies that might indicate an altercation between the colonists.
The only clue was a word carved into a wooden post, Croatoan. There was no cross, meaning the settlers had left willingly. But where had they gone? White never saw his daughter or granddaughter again. His trip, meant to save the colony, ended in silence. This absence, the long delay, the empty camp, and the cryptic carving formed the heart of the Roanoke mystery. And for centuries, the world could only guess what really happened next. The vanished colony. The mystery of Roanoke didn't begin with violence or chaos. It began with silence. When John White finally returned in 1590 after years of delay.
But Governor White doesn't return to his family. He returns to a mystery.
He expected to reunite with the settlers he had left behind. Instead, he found an abandoned fort and a ghost town. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no graves, and no evidence of battle. The homes were gone, the defenses dismantled, and not a single settler remained. Everything pointed not to destruction, but disappearance. Then came the only trace of what had happened. At the entrance to the fort, carved into a wooden post, was the word Croatoan. On a nearby tree, 3 letters, C-R-O.
White and the English see this word, Croatan. And then carved into a tree, 3 letters, C-R-O.
Had been engraved into the bark. Before he left, White had instructed the colonists to carve out their new location if they had to move. If they had been forced to flee or were in danger, they were to add a cross. But there was no cross. The message was simple, direct, and without signs of panic. This suggested the colonists had relocated willingly. Croatoan was not a mystery to White. It was the name of an island to the south, now known as Hatteris Island.
Dug on what is now Hatteris Island have found fascinating artifacts that definitely are made in the time of the lost colonists.
It was also home to a native tribe that had once welcomed the English. The possibility that the settlers had moved there gave White real hope. He believed that his family and the others might still be alive, waiting to be rescued. Driven by this clue, White pushed to set sail for Croatoan. He urged the captain of the ship to head south and follow the trail. But the weather had its own plan. A violent storm struck before they could leave, tearing through the coastline. The ship's anchor was lost, the sails were damaged, and the crew, already low on food and exhausted by the long journey, refused to press on. White had no choice but to abandon the search. He left the colony again, but this time it was final. His last journal entries reveal more than frustration. They show heartbreak. He was a man who had failed to return in time, who had let down the very people he was meant to protect. He sailed back to England, never knowing what became of his daughter, his granddaughter Virginia Dare, or the other settlers. That single word, Croatoan, became the final link to a vanished colony. It marked the point where facts gave way to speculation, where history turned into legend, and it left behind a question that would echo for centuries. What really happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? Centuries of speculation. For over 400 years, the fate of the Roanoke colonists remained one of America's most haunting questions, until science finally caught up in 2025. But before that breakthrough, the world spun countless theories to explain how over 100 people vanished without a trace. Soon after John White's failed return in 1590, whispers of survivors began to surface. By the early 16th century, English settlers at Jamestown heard strange reports from nearby native tribes. Some described men and women with pale skin, gray eyes, and clothing unlike their own.
Jim Horn, a scholar on the project, tells us that they found the remains of a skull and partial bone leg of a 14-year-old girl.
Others spoke broken English or claimed to be descendants of white ancestors who came long ago. Even stranger were stories of villages deep inland, laid out in neat rows, something more common to English towns than native ones. These accounts offered a spark of hope. Could the Roanoke settlers have abandoned the island and joined friendly tribes? Explorers followed these leads, searching far and wide, but each expedition returned with nothing solid. Oral stories faded, and the trail went cold. Over time, new theories took root. Some believed the colonists were killed in a violent clash with hostile tribes, but the lack of bodies, weapons, or signs of a battle at Roanoke made that unlikely. Others thought disease or famine wiped them out. Still, no mass graves or evidence of disease were ever found. Another idea blamed Spanish soldiers, who were known to patrol the Atlantic coast and destroy English outposts. Yet, records showed no Spanish activity near Roanoke during that period. As the mystery lingered, stories grew stranger. By the 18th century, romanticized legends claimed that the settlers had disturbed sacred ground and were cursed. Others suggested that Roanoke Island itself was somehow cursed or haunted, feeding the myth more than the facts. In the 19th century, archaeologists began searching for real answers. Excavations on Roanoke Island uncovered pieces of pottery, broken tools, and glass beads. These could have belonged to the colonists, or they might have come from later European traders. Nothing was ever conclusive. Then came the infamous Dare Stones in 1937. These carved rocks supposedly held messages from Eleanor Dare, John White's daughter, describing the colony's downfall. At first, the stones caused a national sensation, but after deeper study, most were exposed as fakes. Despite decades of false starts and dead ends, the mystery never lost momentum. Roanoke became more than a historical question. It became a cultural obsession. A lost colony, a vanished people, and a single word carved into wood became symbols of America's unsolved past. Generations searched for answers, but it would take advances in modern science, genetics, satellite imaging, and soil analysis to finally reveal what really happened to the Roanoke colonists. That moment came in 2025. The hidden fort on the map. For over 400 years,
Blaine says nobody had ever thought to look under those patches in 400 years.
The trail of the Roanoke colonists seemed to vanish after 1590, but in 2012, a quiet discovery at the British Museum changed everything and set science on the path that would finally solve the mystery by 2025. A historian was examining La Virginia Pars, a 1587 watercolor map made by John White, the colony's governor. At first glance, the map looked like any other from the era, but one section drew attention. A patch near the confluence of the Roanoke and Chowan rivers had been covered by a tiny piece of paper. Using backlighting, a technique that shines light through old documents to reveal hidden marks, the researcher saw something unusual: a faint drawing of a square-shaped fort, sketched with iron gall ink. That small, nearly invisible fort was about 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island. It matched a note in John White's journal that mentioned the settlers' plan to move 50 miles into Maine. This old phrase meant they intended to relocate to the mainland. Suddenly, a forgotten patch on a centuries-old map became the most promising clue in the entire investigation. The discovery sent ripples through the historical community. Why had White hidden the fort's location beneath paper? One idea is that he wanted to protect the colony from Spanish spies. In the 1580s, England and Spain were locked in conflict, and Spain often tried to destroy rival settlements. Another theory suggests that White wasn't sure if the settlement would survive and wanted to avoid exposing a possible failure. Regardless of the reason, the map took on new meaning. It was no longer just a chart. It was a coded message from the past. The hidden fort pointed to a location in what is now Bertie County, North Carolina. Historians named the site Site X. Excited by the discovery, the First Colony Foundation, a team focused on solving the Roanoke mystery, sent archaeologist Nick Lucchetti and his team to investigate. Site X sat along the Albemarle Sound, surrounded by thick woods and far from prying eyes. It made sense as a place where settlers might seek safety, fresh water, and a second chance at survival. The faint fort drawing revealed a different kind of disappearance, not one caused by disaster, but by a planned move inland. It also changed how experts saw the word Croatoan, carved into a post at Roanoke. Maybe it wasn't the whole story, just one clue in a wider plan to survive. Site X unearthed. What began as a faded ink mark on a centuries-old map soon became the center of the most important breakthrough in solving the Roanoke mystery. After the 2012 discovery of a hidden fort, drawn beneath a patch on John White's map, archaeologists turned their attention to a place now known as Site X, tucked inside the thick forests of Bertie County, North Carolina, about 50 miles inland from Roanoke Island. This location promised the first real answers in over 400 years. Led by archaeologist Nick Lucchetti, the First Colony Foundation began excavating the area, which bordered an abandoned Native American village called Metaquem. At first, the ground looked unremarkable, just woods and underbrush, but soon, pieces of the past began to surface. The team uncovered English pottery fragments, including bowls and jars with a green glaze known as Surrey Hampshire ware. This pottery style matched what was used in England during the late 1580s, placing it squarely within the time of the lost colony. One detail made these findings stand out. There were no clay tobacco pipes. At other colonial sites like Jamestown,
a new and rather jarring revelation has been made by archaeologists excavating the Jamestown colony site in Virginia,
which was settled in 1607, tobacco pipes are found everywhere. By contrast, Site X had none. This difference helped confirm that the artifacts dated to the Roanoke era, before tobacco use became common among English settlers. To dig deeper, literally and figuratively, the team used ground-penetrating radar. Beneath the surface, they found signs of human activity, post holes and fire pits that suggested people had once lived there for some time. These underground features hinted at buildings, possibly blending both English and Native American designs. It looked less like a temporary camp and more like a small, lasting settlement. This sparked a new theory. Perhaps some of the Roanoke settlers didn't vanish after all. Instead, they might have moved inland, away from danger or famine, and built a life in secret. Living near Metaquem, they may have traded with or even lived among local tribes. English pottery found alongside native tools supported the idea of contact or even cooperation between the two groups. Not everyone agreed. Some experts argued that the artifacts might have belonged to an earlier English mission or were trade items passed along by Native Americans, but the sheer amount and style of pottery, plus the location, strongly pointed to Roanoke settlers. Site X took the story in a bold new direction. It showed that the disappearance wasn't a dead end. It was a change in direction. These settlers didn't simply vanish. They adapted, moved inland, and left behind clues that modern science would finally uncover centuries later. Hatteris Island's secrets. As scientists searched inland for answers, another part of the Roanoke mystery began to unfold far from Site X. It wasn't in the woods, but on the coast, on Hatteris Island, once known as Croatoan. This island sits about 50 miles southeast of Roanoke Island, and here, the clues didn't point to a vanished colony, but to one that may have survived by becoming part of something new. British archaeologist Mark Horton and local historian Scott Dawson of the Croatoan Archaeological Society led a dig on the island. What they found challenged long-held beliefs.
Have found fascinating artifacts that definitely are made in the time of the lost colonists.
Beneath layers of sand and soil, they unearthed several English items from the late 1580s, a rusted rapier hilt, old gun parts, and a broken slate tablet with faint English writing. These were not random scraps left by travelers. They were personal items, likely belonging to people who had lived and worked on the island for some time. Even more powerful than the objects were the stories passed down by local native communities, especially the Lumbee. For generations, they spoke of white settlers joining the Croatoan tribe, starting families, and adopting native ways. Historians once called these tales myths, but now, with physical evidence in hand, they're being taken more seriously. Dawson, who grew up on the island and has family roots there, gathered these stories and findings in his 2020 book, The Lost Colony and Hatteris Island. His research pointed to one bold idea, that many of the lost settlers had moved to Croatoan and blended in. Evidence showed a mix of English and native life. Tools from England were found beside native pottery, showing signs of cooperation and shared knowledge. It's possible the settlers taught metalwork in exchange for learning how to survive by fishing and hunting. These signs suggested something new, a community shaped by two cultures coming together. Unlike Site X, which implied that settlers built alone in the woods, Hatteris Island showed a different path. The Croatoan people were more welcoming than other nearby tribes, and they may have offered shelter to colonists struggling with drought, hunger, or conflict. To survive, the settlers likely gave up parts of their English identity, hiding in plain sight to avoid enemies like Spanish scouts. Still, they seemed to hold on to pieces of their past. The writing on the slate tablet may have been one such effort, a quiet reminder of who they were. Hatteris Island didn't just add to the mystery, it changed it. Instead of a story about vanishing without a trace, it became one about survival, choice, and change. The settlers may not have disappeared, they adapted, living on through the people and places they became part of. The science of survival. By 2025, scientists no longer relied on guesses or incomplete records to solve the Roanoke mystery. Instead, they used advanced tools and technology to dig deeper without disturbing the land. The result was a clearer, more complete view of what likely happened to the missing colony. These breakthroughs showed that the settlers didn't disappear. They adapted, survived, and split into different groups. At Site X, Site Y, and Hatteris Island, researchers turned to LiDAR technology. This system uses lasers to scan the ground and create detailed images by removing layers of trees and brush from the picture. With it, they uncovered signs of fences, fire pits, and building posts, proof that people had lived there for some time. Ground-penetrating radar added even more detail. It revealed structures buried beneath the soil at all three locations, without having to dig a single hole. Together, these tools proved that life continued well beyond Roanoke, in places where few had thought to look. Scientists also studied the artifacts left behind. Pottery pieces, metal tools, and other items found at these sites matched materials made in England during the late 15th century. They were different from the kinds found at later colonies like Jamestown. Tests confirmed that these items came from around 1587 to 1590, the same years the Roanoke settlers vanished. This ruled out later English visitors and confirmed that these objects belonged to the original colony. But the strongest link came from DNA. Researchers collected genetic samples from families in Native American tribes near Hatteras, especially the Lumbee people. Their DNA showed traces of European ancestry that dated back to the same period as the lost colony. These markers were too old to be from later contact with settlers. Instead, they matched the idea that Roanoke colonists had joined local tribes and started families, just as many oral histories had claimed for generations. The science told a new story, one built on solid data rather than guesses. It revealed that the settlers did not vanish because of a single disaster. Instead, they likely divided into at least two groups. Some moved inland, while others found a home with the Croatoan tribe on Hatteris Island. They survived by learning new ways of life, mixing cultures, and leaving behind both physical and genetic traces. What was once seen as a tragic mystery is now viewed as a story of strength and smart choices. Thanks to modern science, the Roanoke colony is no longer just lost. It has been found in the land, the bones, and the bloodlines of the people who still live there today. The 2025 burial discovery. In early 2025, scientists found the most human piece of the Roanoke puzzle yet. Not a lost artifact or vague clue, but a person. Near the Chowan River in Bertie County, North Carolina, only a few miles from Site X, a research team made a quiet but powerful discovery: a single grave. What they uncovered didn't just support earlier theories, it helped rewrite the story of the lost colony altogether. During a routine excavation led by the First Colony Foundation, archaeologist Nick Lucchetti's team uncovered a nearly complete skeleton buried with care. The body was laid out in a traditional Christian position, on her back, head facing west, and feet pointing east, as if waiting for resurrection at sunrise. This style of burial was common in late 16th century England and showed respect and belief, even in difficult times. There were no items buried with her, only the body and the soil around it. What truly confirmed her identity came through DNA. Tests showed the woman had European, specifically English, ancestry. Even more telling, the DNA pointed to the late 1580s, which ruled out settlers from later colonies like Jamestown. Her grave was also far from Roanoke Island or Hatteris, meaning she likely died after moving inland. Part of the group believed to have split off in search of better conditions and safety. This woman's presence inland confirmed more than just a migration. It showed survival. Her Christian burial hinted that the group maintained their traditions even while adapting to a new land. Researchers believe she may have lived among or near native tribes, such as those in the nearby Metachem village, blending new alliances with old beliefs. Her story also fits with discoveries from Hatteris Island, where English items and Lumbee oral histories suggest that some settlers joined the Croatoan tribe and started families. Together, these pieces show a split path. One group turned inland, as this woman's grave suggests, while another moved to the coast and integrated into native communities. This single grave offered something the mystery had never produced before: clear physical proof that at least one colonist had not vanished, but endured. It gave researchers something personal to connect with. One archaeologist admitted to being deeply moved, seeing her not as a mystery, but as a real person who faced the unknown and survived, even if only for a time. The Roanoke colony didn't end in disappearance. It changed, adapted, and endured through its people. This woman's final resting place is more than a grave. It is a story carved into the ground, proving that the lost weren't lost at all. They were there, just waiting to be found. A mystery, no more. For centuries, the fate of the Roanoke colony stood as one of America's oldest unsolved mysteries. The word Croatoan carved into a tree sparked endless theories: massacres, disease, starvation, even supernatural vanishings. But in 2025, science and archaeology gave us something more valuable than guesswork: real answers. From the coastal dunes of Hatteris Island to the inland forests of Site X and Site Y, evidence showed that the colonists didn't vanish into thin air. They split up, adapted, and survived in ways no one had fully imagined. English tools found beside native pottery told of shared lives. A slate tablet bearing faint English script hinted at a deep need to hold on to identity. Oral histories passed down by the Lumbee and other tribes, once dismissed, now stood validated by DNA and artifacts. And a lone woman, buried in Christian fashion far from the original colony, proved that the settlers carried their beliefs into the wilds of Carolina and lived on. These discoveries, quiet, buried, and hard-won, reshaped how we view the so-called lost colony. They were not lost. They were absorbed, scattered, and made new lives among native people, adapting to their surroundings and forging unexpected futures. Today, the Roanoke story is no longer one of disappearance. It's a story of survival, of change, of people who crossed an ocean to start fresh, and when abandoned, didn't give up. They adapted, they blended, and in doing so, became part of a history that lived on in bones, soil, and bloodlines. Thanks to decades of digging, research, and evolving technology, the voices of those settlers are no longer whispers in the woods. They've been heard, clearer than ever before. And now, the mystery of the lost colony is no longer a question. It's an answer. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.